Tonight we have Anand against Gelfand from 2022, and it is a game about generosity. 3 times Black offers material for activity, 3 times Anand looks at it, takes what he wants, and keeps working on one file. It comes from the 35th Leon tournament, and the opening is a Sicilian. Let's watch how the file gets opened. Anand opens with e4, and Gelfand answers with c5. Knight to f3 develops, knight to c6 answers, and the bishop drops to b5, staring at that knight. Black shores things up with e6, and white simply trades, bishop takes c6, and notice the little detail it leaves behind. The pawn on d7 is tied to its king along that diagonal. Pawn takes c6 rebuilds, and black owns 2 bishops. Anand's answer is a modest d3. Knight to e7 looks for better squares. The other white knight comes to d2, and nobody is in any hurry. Then the queen settles on c7, looking down the diagonal toward h2, and the h-pawn steps out to h4. Keep an eye on that pawn. Black claims the middle with e5, so the h-pawn keeps going h5, taking away the kingside squares before black can use them. The reply f6 props up the center. Knight to f1 begins a slow regrouping. Black expands with d5, white questions that pawn with c4, and the bishop comes out to e6 to hold the line. Now b3 props up c4, and the tension in the center has evened everything out. Gelfand castles queenside, tucking the king away, and the position is genuinely level. Anand's queen slides quietly to e2, and here comes the first of the 3. Would you volunteer this pawn? Gelfand plays g5, offering it to the bishop on c1 and the knight, space for his pieces, but his own king cover is thinning. So what was wrong with waiting? Let me show you the calmer road. Rook to g8 first, loading the file before committing the pawn. Black keeps the balance, keeps the pawn, and white has nothing to bite on. But that is not what happened. The pawn went to g5 and the h-file opened instead. The h-pawn snaps off the capture on g6, tearing a hole in front of the black king's old home. Knight takes g6 restores order, and Anand's knight steps to g3 natural and slightly wrong. The modest pawn to g3 was the move, because now black gets to strike first in the center. Why the pawn instead of the piece? Because pawn to g3 props up the f4 square and keeps the h-file for the rook without inviting anything. Watch the difference. Nothing enters, and white is the comfortable one. In the game, though, it was the knight that went to g3. Gelfand cracks the center open, pawn takes c4, white recaptures, pawn takes c4, and the knight leaps into f4, hitting the queen on e2 and the pawn on g2 at once. Tempting, but is the queen in any real trouble? She has 2 defenders, and the c1 bishop already looks at f4. So bishop takes f4, removes the visitor, pawn takes f4, recaptures, and now the knight on g3 is being asked questions. It answers by hopping into f5, rook to g8 eyes the pawn on g2, king to f1 defends it by hand, and now sacrifice number 2, bishop to d6 planted right in front of the knight. Can white just take it? He can, but the queen and the rook both look at d6, so it is a trade, not a gift. Anand prefers to pile up instead, rook to d1, and the file points straight at that bishop. Gelfand grabs the knight, bishop takes f5, pawn takes f5 recaptures, the queen swings to g7, the knight drops back to e1, and then the bishop retreats to c7. And that is a concession, because the d-file is now clear from Anand's rook all the way to the rook on d8. White is clearly better. So what does an open file with 2 rooks on it produce? Rook takes d8 with check, and from that square the rook touches both the king on c8 and the rook on g8. Black can take it back 3 different ways. The rook does the honors, rook takes d8, and now the other rook finally uses that old h-pawn's work, rook to h3. King to b7 steps aside, knight to d3 eyes the loose pawn on c5, queen to f8 defends but leaves the pawn on h7 to its fate. Rook takes h7, and look what that does. The bishop on c7 is now stuck on the 7th rank between the rook and its own king, and it cannot even reach the rook to remove it. Queen to d6 lines up on the knight, and the knight simply steps back to e1, unbothered. Then king to b8, and this is where the game slips away. Was there something better? There was, the rook could have offered itself on d7 to trade off white's most annoying piece. Watch that idea. Rook to d7 walks into the rook's line on purpose. White takes, rook takes d7, and the queen recaptures on d7. White is better, but the monster on the 7th has been swapped away and black can still defend. Instead, the king went to b8 and the rook stayed exactly where it wanted to be. Anand's queen steps up to e6, touching the pawn on f6, and Gelfand offers a trade with queen to e5, hitting the knight on e1 and the queen at the same time. It looks like relief. It is not. Queen takes e5, and here is the same trick again. The bishop on c7 recaptures, yes, but only because the capture removes the very piece pinning it. Anand is winning comfortably now. Bishop takes e5, and now the rook's line runs unbroken all the way to the pawn on a7. King to e2 walks toward the action. Bishop to c3 tries to make a nuisance of itself, and the knight returns to d3, eyeing c5 and f4. Then the third and last offer, pawn to f3 with check. White may take it with the pawn or simply step aside, and either way black has spent a pawn for very little. Anand takes, pawn takes f3. Rook to e8 gives another check. The king tucks over to f1. Bishop to d4 leans on f2. The knight comes to f4 and the rook drops to e5, hunting the pawn on f5. The knight jumps to e6 and suddenly the bishop on d4 is the loose piece. Should black really be collecting pawns here? Rook takes f5 does it anyway, and while the rook is away, the bishop is hanging and the whole black position comes apart. White is completely winning. What did the position need instead? A pawn move, a 6, giving the king a breath and taking the rook on the 7th out of its comfortable line. Still bad, but still a game. That is not what happened though. The rook went hunting on f5, and Anand's simple f4 traps the rook's escape squares and hits it. Here Gelfand resigned. He had no way to keep both the trapped rook and the loose bishop on d4, and his king was still sitting on the back rank with white's rook cutting the 7th from h7 all the way to a7. That rook decided everything, and it was invited in by a pawn push on move 7, the little h4 nobody looked twice at. If you take one thing from this game, take that. Opening a file early costs you almost nothing, and 30 moves later it can be the only thing on the board that matters. Thanks for watching Nocturne Chess. If you enjoyed this game, subscribe for more quiet journeys through chess history. Until the next board, good night.